woman during a protest near the Barclays Center in Brooklyn on.
Hi, everyone. My name is Colin, and I'm a member of the New York Community Action Project. Welcome to our first official Instagram live stream, and thank you all for tuning in with us tonight. So today we're going to be discussing the NYPD's brutal response to the popular uprisings this summer and the ways that these NYPD officers can be held accountable. So we'll go over some of the data and reports that have come out summarizing the police violence and the systematic human rights and civil rights abuses, as well as some of the lawsuits that are ongoing against the NYPD as a result of these abuses. And we're going to finish off by talking about NYCAP's campaign for community control of the police. So also, please feel free to post any questions that you may have in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them after the presentation. So let's start with some of these specific facts and patterns of abuse that we witnessed this summer. So as you all know, on May 25th of last year, the Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin, along with his accomplices in the police department, murdered George Floyd on camera, kneeling on his neck for more than 8 minutes. George Floyd was a Black man from Fayetteville, North Carolina. And in addition to uplifting George Floyd and shining a spotlight on his case, demonstrations this summer also called attention to other police killings of Black people, specifically including Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade, among others. So all around the country, we saw people taking to the streets to demand an end to these police murders of Black people and this impunity that they enjoy. In New York City, tens of thousands of people took to the streets, including members of NYCAP, who joined the first night of protests in Fort Greene and downtown Brooklyn, and continued to participate in and support the uprising during the following months at different protests and in different capacities. So some of our viewers tonight may recall the city soon imposed a curfew to suppress these demonstrations and to stop them from happening. They accused protesters of looting, but as someone who was present at the uprisings from day one, I can say that I personally never witnessed any of that, and it's very clear to me why the curfew was imposed as a way to crack down on protests against police brutality and to stop community organizing. Nonetheless, the cops used the curfew as a justification to crack down on protests, and rampant, widespread police abuse ensued across the city. Now, we as NYCAP have compiled a short video montage for this evening, which should play just below my screen. But please be aware that it includes footage of graphic police violence that could be triggering and traumatic for some viewers. So videos that came out over the summer, which you can see some of them, showed officers shoving protesters, beating them with batons, pepper spraying people with their hands up, hitting protesters with police bikes, accelerating police cruisers into crowds of people, and even pulling down one individual in order to spray them in the face at one point. And you can see some of these incidents in the video footage. One video that we've included shows a woman being shoved backwards by an officer so violently that it knocked her to the concrete, caused her to have a concussion, and later to suffer a seizure as well. Another video shows designated National Lawyers Guild legal observers being harassed, manhandled, and arrested by cops. And the most recent statistics that I've seen suggest that at least 10 legal observers were arrested by police officers, even though they had been given special guarantees by the city that they were considered essential workers and that they would not be targeted for violating the curfew. We saw instances of medics also being arrested by the police. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And many of you will also remember some of the tactics that the police were using. One of them that has gotten a lot of pushback and a lot of attention recently is what's called peddling, which is a tactic where the police essentially use their bikes, bodies, cars, whatever technology, whatever equipment they have, to create a perimeter that can block protesters and prevent them from dispersing.
Why are they doing this?
So it's a tactic where you keep people in a limited, small, compressed amount of space. You prevent them from leaving until after a curfew is already passed. Then at that point, it becomes unlawful, and they send in officers to go and beat these protesters and arrest as many of them as possible, even after explicitly preventing them from leaving as they had hoped to do. I remember one of the first nights in the protest, one of the scariest things for me was hearing reports on Twitter and video of activists who had been kettled by police on one of the bridges in New York City. They were prevented from entering Manhattan and also prevented from returning back to Brooklyn for a significant amount of time. We also saw many cases of the police forming lines of riot cops. They'll line up with their riot equipment, and then all of a sudden they'll just charge into crowds. They all start running all at once towards the crowd. I witnessed this myself multiple times, and there's plenty of video footage of this as well. This tactic caused widespread panic and led to stampedes and injuries as people tried to get out of the way of officers swinging their batons and spraying pepper spray at peaceful gatherings. Personally, during the first nights of protests in Brooklyn, I witnessed this tactic used over and over again, and I even saw one officer actually shoved me personally off of a sidewalk into a busy street while I had my hands up. I saw a woman next to me shoved to the ground by police officers in downtown Brooklyn who claimed that they thought she may have thrown something. When the cops knocked her down violently, her purse went flying, her belongings were scattered all across the ground, and the police immediately rushed in, encircled her, and prevented people from helping her, threatening us with pepper spray. Another NYCAP member was hit in the leg with a police baton while he was trying to get the name and medical information of someone who was being arrested, which is something that all of us should be doing as a way to protect each other. The police also pepper sprayed that member of NYCAP for no reason whatsoever other than trying to take care of people. Additionally, almost none of the officers that I saw, that other NYCAP members saw, or that were caught in these videos were wearing PPE of any kind. We see over and over again officers not wearing their masks, not wearing face shields, not even attempting to reduce the risk of COVID in the middle of a pandemic. Even though there was also at the time a direct citywide order in place that required masks to be worn, the cops were flagrantly violating that. So over the summer, we saw these same patterns repeated over and over again with almost no consequences or repercussions for the officers involved. At the same time, we had city elected officials like Mayor de Blasio saying things like, "I saw no use of force around peaceful protests, despite all of the video that had emerged already, and that the NYPD were using as light a touch as possible." And Governor Cuomo also added, quote, "Police bludgeon peaceful protesters with batons for no reason. That's not a fact. They don't do that." We all saw that happening. We all know that that was happening. With regard to video footage of police accelerating their SUVs into crowds of people, Mayor de Blasio said, "Imagine what it'd be like. You're just trying to do your job and then you see hundreds of people converging on you. I'm not going to blame officers who are trying to deal with an absolutely impossible situation." And he called the protesters people who chose to commit acts of violence and are here only, unfortunately, to agitate and to attack those who protect us, our police officers. Any of us who were following these protests or present at them know that they had very clear, very important political demands, including a wide range of reforms to policing. It is absurd to say that their only purpose was to agitate and attack police officers, but this is the kind of rhetoric that we see them use to justify these heinous tactics against us. So overall, what did we see? From the end of May to the beginning of July, the Attorney General Letitia James received more than 1,300 individual complaints of excessive use of force by NYPD officers during the summer uprisings. From May 8 to June 7, the Attorney General's office calculated that there were more than 2,087 arrests related to the protest. So that's the situation citywide, but we also wanted to focus on one protest in particular, and that's the protest that happened on June 4th in Mott Haven, which is in the South Bronx. The protest started at the intersection of 3rd Avenue and 149th Street, which those of you who are familiar with the Bronx might know that is the area referred to usually as the hub, colloquially. NYCAP has been tabling and organizing at that intersection for a little over a year now, so we were especially tuned into protests there. And it's also important to recognize that that specific neighborhood, Mott Haven, and the broader South Bronx has a history of over-policing and brutality. And in fact, the 40th Police Precinct in Mott Haven has received the most complaints of excessive use of physical force by police officers of any of the NYC's 77 precincts since 2015. So this is a protest taking place in the heart of police misconduct, systemic brutality, and over-policing and criminalizing these communities. So on that day, June 4th, more than 260 people were arrested all at once at Mott Haven at that protest. The police showed up, they followed the protesters, and then set up a wall using their bikes to prevent the protesters from leaving and going home before the curfew. They kept protesters there until after the curfew had already set in. Then once it had set in, they sent police officers into the captive crowd, which was blocked on both sides and had no way of going home, no way of dispersing. In fact, no way of abiding by the curfew. And these officers started beating people with their batons and spraying pepper spray into the crowd. Video footage actually shows police officers getting on top of police cars and swinging down with their police batons onto defenseless protesters. Overall, at least 61 people reported injuries from that protest as a result of police use of force and excessive brutality. It's really important also to note that the NYPD police chief, Terrence Monahan, was personally present that day at those protests and was giving orders to the officers. The specific protest and brutal police response has been investigated by numerous human rights organizations, and there are a few excellent reports that have come out since then, and we just wanted to highlight a few of these reports so that if you wish to go and read further and read some of the firsthand accounts of what was happening, you have some resources for that. So in September of last year, Human Rights Watch released a report entitled "Kettling Protesters in the Bronx, Systemic Police Brutality and Its Cost in the United States." And that report was based on interviews and written accounts of more than 81 people who attended that protest. It's an extremely thorough report. And it confirmed that police had kettled protesters and prevented them from dispersing before sending police into the crowd, and this is the report's language, unprovoked and without warning, wailing their batons, beating people from car tops, shoving them to the ground, and firing pepper spray in their faces. The report also found that clearly identified medics and legal observers were among those targeted, as police beat a number of them, detained them, and obstructed their work. Just to take a moment to explain the idea of medics, there's something called street medics, which attend a protest specifically to provide medical care for people who may be injured or may have medical needs during the protest. These people are very clearly identified, often wearing their scrubs or other medical insignia, and often will also have red crosses taped to their bodies and taped to their outfits, just to make it extremely clear that they are there to protect people and keep people safe. The Human Rights Watch found that the NYPD was specifically targeting them for arrests. The NYPD's highest ranking uniformed officer, who I mentioned before, Chief of Department Terrence Monahan, was present with at least 24 other uniformed supervisory officers, so supervisors, chiefs, lieutenants, captains, or inspectors in white shirts. We also saw members of the NYPD's legal unit that were present at that protest, watching it all happening, and in fact, giving their support for it. The police response to the peaceful Mott Haven protest was intentional, planned, and unjustified. Indeed, according to the NYPD commissioner, Dermot Shea, what he says is, "We had a plan which was executed nearly flawlessly in the Bronx. So all of this brutality, all of these injuries, this mistreatment of people was the plan that, according to the NYPD commissioner, was a flawless execution of a plan that they had made ahead of time to do that to these people, to do that to the protesters who had assembled." All in all, Human Rights Watch counted 21 incidents of police beating protesters with batons, in many cases, again, standing atop parked cars, 11 incidents of police officers punching or kicking protesters, 19 incidents of police slamming, tackling, or dragging protesters, 14 incidents of police firing pepper spray directly into participants' faces, 4 incidents of police throwing their bikes against protesters, which can cause serious physical injury if a police officer is throwing their metal bike at you, and 2 incidents where the police restrained participants using a knee to the face or upper neck, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, is something that can cause extreme injury and even death. Human Rights Watch also documented at least 61 cases of protesters, legal observers, and bystanders who sustained injuries during the crackdown in Mott Haven, including lacerations, a broken nose, losing a tooth, shoulder sprains, a broken finger, split lip, black eyes, bruises, difficulty breathing, and difficulty seeing as a result of pepper spray being applied directly to people's faces, and potential nerve damage due to the tightness of the zip ties that the officers had put on people. Finally, according to the Human Rights Watch report, police conduct during the Mott Haven protest on June 4th amounts to what they consider serious violations of international human rights law, which the federal, state, and local governments are obligated to serve. So all of those statistics came from one single protest in Mott Haven. There was a second report that was released about that same protest by a group called Physicians for Human Rights. And that report condemned unlawful and excessive force against peaceful protesters, medics, and others. The Physicians for Human Rights report is also, I think, especially insightful because it includes interviews with 3 physicians and a nurse who were present at that protest specifically so that they could provide any needed medical care. All 4 of those designated, clearly identified health professionals were specifically targeted for arrests, and they reported witnessing abuses that range from cutting off people's circulation to their hands by tying the zip cuffs too tight, to where people's fingers and hands were changing color and going numb, all the way to depriving one woman, a diabetic woman, of her insulin and glucose monitor while they were detaining her, which prevented her from taking care of her diabetes for hours at a time. When one of the medics interviewed told an officer of her concerns for public health, she mentioned, I think this individual next to me, his hands could suffer permanent nerve damage. You need to loosen those. The medic was told by an officer, quote, "If you cared about your health, you wouldn't be out here protesting." That's what the officer told a medic who went out of her way to try to provide needed help for people organizing against police brutality and for justice for these victims. The report concludes that the NYPD, and this is a quote, employed unlawful and excessive force against peaceful protesters, medics, and others, created perilously crowded conditions by kettling the protesters and medics in the setting of a pandemic, beat protesters while interfering with their access to immediate medical care for their injuries from volunteer medics, arrested those volunteer medics in violation of New York City's curfew regulations, which again specifically said medics would not be targeted, also violating human rights law and respect for the ethical duties of healthcare workers and the rights of the injured to receive medical care. And finally, subjected volunteer medics and others to dangerous detention conditions during a global pandemic. And if you read through the Physicians for Human Rights reports, there's a lot of interview accounts of these medical professionals once they were taken to holding cells, describing the truly heinous conditions and incredible disregard for the health and safety of people who are being detained. Things like detaining many people in one 8x10 holding cell without giving them masks, without properly providing water, without providing hand sanitizer, without providing any possibility for social distancing. And again, the attitude of the police, well, if you cared about your health, you would be out here protesting. We've covered some of these common patterns of police misconduct that occurred during this summer. Let's discuss some of the attempts to hold them accountable and what we do as people to organize against this kind of violent and unchecked police brutality. There are multiple ongoing lawsuits against the NYPD on behalf of individual protesters whose rights were violated. Bronx Defenders is a public defense and legal aid organization that's representing many of those who were directly injured. There's also a lawsuit that has been filed by the New York Civil Liberties Union and Legal Aid Society in October of 2020, which alleges that the NYPD actions violated the First and Fourth Amendments of the United States Constitution and their counterparts in the New York Constitution. That lawsuit is seeking monetary damages and so monetary relief for 11 specific individuals who are the named plaintiffs of the lawsuit, meaning these are the individuals whose testimony in case the lawsuit is grounded on. But the lawsuit also alleges that more broadly, during the period of these protests, the mayor and police leadership were aware of NYPD actions to violently suppress protests. Their corresponding inaction to address this pattern and statements and actions that endorsed that behavior constitute a city policy to engage in excessive force, discriminate on the basis of viewpoint against those fighting for greater police accountability for brutality, and to retaliate against people engaged in their constitutionally protected right to protest. Now, despite these lawsuits, which we hope that all of those are successful, and we hope that we can all support these lawsuits, very little has been done to create actual transparency and accountability in a structural way. Overall, very few officers have actually been disciplined based on what they did this summer. There have been a few sort of marginal cases where the video footage was just so obscene that the police department was forced to take action against these officers. The two examples that I know of are the officer who was shown earlier in the video footage pulling the mask down off of a protester in order to pepper spray them in the face. That officer, I understand, was on a temporary suspension. That was that person's discipline. And the second case that I know of disciplining specific officers is the cop who shoved the woman to the ground at the very beginning of the video footage that we showed, who caused her to have a seizure and a concussion. And that officer has actually been arrested and charged with assault, among other things. And I think it's just important that we note that the two people who have actually faced concussions are cases where there has been video footage that is so damning and so unjustifiable that the NYPD and the city could not deny that those things had happened or could not come up with excuses. In every other case, they seem to be able to come up with excuses to blame the protesters, to excuse the police officers who were doing this, or at the very most to say, okay, we're going to do a temporary suspension while we look into what happened. But it is not the kind of structural change that we as NYCAP believe is needed. At this point in time, there have been no significant structural changes implemented within the NYPD to account for and prevent the kind of abuses and brutality that we witnessed this summer. So that's why we as NYCAP are calling for a CPAC. A CPAC stands for a Civilian Police Accountability Council, which is an all-elected, all-civilian body that would have the power to fire, investigate, press charges against officers, as well as to control their training, police policies and procedures, and even budgetary issues. This would be a body that is made up of all elected, all civilian representatives, and specifically does not include any police officers, people who are contractors for the police or supervisors for the police, have a relationship with the police department. If you are related to the police department, you are not eligible to be part of the CPAC. It is a genuinely community control of the police model where those being policed have actual power over the people who are beating and abusing and depriving them of their rights. And we believe that genuine community control over all aspects of policing is the best way to take power away from the NYPD and relocate it in the hands of community members who are actually on the brunt of that policing. And we hope that you'll join our campaign for a CPAC. We have a lot more information about CPAC that's available on our social media as well as our website, which is linked in the description. We also have a contact us information box, which I think should be over there. So please do get in touch. We would love to have your support, and hopefully together we can bring about some structural changes that take the power away from the police department and really seriously put it in the hands of those who for too long have been put under the boot of police officers. Thank you again for joining, and we hope to hear from you soon. Let me double check and see how. Okay, perfect. So at this point, it doesn't look like we have any questions, but if any questions come up, or if you have anything that you want to talk more about, or if I mentioned a statistic that you would like some sources for, we're happy to document all of that, and we can send you all those resources. But most importantly, we really hope that you join us in fighting for a CPAC, because it is high time that the NYPD was put under the thumb and control of the communities that live in this city. So thank you.